7 years since its original release, the new The Witcher 3 Complete Edition aims to enhance an already iconic game with a huge suite of extras. On PS5, Xbox Series X, S and PC, it's a free update, listed as patch 4.0. Visuals are enhanced, quality of life improvements are added, like the new camera, plus we get extras to tie into the Netflix TV show. This much we already knew from our preview after a visit to CD Projekt Red's offices, but today we have the final release, the finished article, letting us check out areas beyond just the White Orchard at last. The taxing Novigrad city is in view this time, and likewise the infamous Crookback Bog. Now, if you've followed my coverage of The Witcher 3 stretching back 7 years now, this will feel like a reunion of sorts, except it's new hardware this time. PS5 and Series X's new ray tracing mode is in the spotlight, as pitted against the original last-gen version, played on PS4 Pro in this case. So just how much of an upgrade does it really make? And does performance hold up at 30 frames per second with all its new ray tracing features, or even 60 frames per second in the alternative performance mode? Let's find out. In truth, I say final release, but that's never really the case these days. This is The Witcher 3 Complete Edition on patch 4.01, but we are expecting a follow-up patch to land soon, 4.02, which is promised to improve performance on PS5, Series X, S and PC. The time frame for 4.02 going live is still not confirmed though, so honestly making this video has been like working with an axe swinging overhead, knowing patch 4.02 could just drop at any time and suddenly change everything. Still, I work with what I've got here. Also, a side note that the PC release has obviously seen a number of issues at launch, with reports of bugs, crashes and worse performance than before the patch. To keep the focus tight for this video though, I'm dialing in as ever on the console experience, PS5 and Series X, with Series S coverage to follow for another video. It hasn't been a 100% smooth launch for this patch 4.0 Complete Edition then, and I'll be getting to the problems later in this video. But on a surface level, the visual upgrades are remarkable, truly bringing The Witcher 3 closer to our expectations of a 2022 release. Okay, the game already looked great, but in the Complete Edition, a bulk of textures and models are reworked, with CDPR contracting PC modder Hulk Hogan, who produced the HD reworked project mod, to incorporate new updated assets into the official release. Foliage is improved too, filling out the landscape with more plant life, and then there's smaller touches like brand new skyboxes, weather states, and this camera lens effect, adding variety as Geralt travels the world by day and night. And of course, as you've just seen, we get this lovely photo mode on PS5 and Series X to show it off, activated by pressing into both sticks. Easily the biggest attraction on PS5 and Series X though is the two new modes, one for performance at 60fps and one for ray tracing at 30fps. No question, the ray tracing features have a huge impact on the look, the depth of The Witcher 3's many locales. In certain spots the difference is stark, for interiors especially. In others, where there's strong sunlight outdoors, well, the effects of the RT mode are less apparent. In this case, we're using PS5 as an example, comparing the performance mode to the RT mode, but all of this applies exactly to Series X too. So, with RT mode enabled, you get two forms of ray tracing, ray traced ambient occlusion and also ray traced global illumination. Now, RTAO primarily affects the shading of the terrain, adding in a natural ambient shade to the environment, points between objects where light naturally struggles to reach. It affects the sandy banks of the White Orchard at dusk here, for example, adding a deeper, richer hue. And then, for interiors with no direct sunlight, it's more absolute. Each bottle on the cabinet of this hut, every corner to the room, is flanked by this heavy shade, as it would be. The harder it is for light to reach, the darker it becomes as you'd expect, and those light bounces are simulated by the team's RTAO. By comparison, yes, the performance mode of course runs at double the frame rate, 60fps, but it also looks visibly plain in these areas. Again, not every area is overhauled to quite the same extent. Pockets of Novigrad City will be shaded more thoroughly as we walk its streets, anything undercover, but the lit portions do look largely unchanged. Meanwhile though, we also have RTGI, Global Illumination, which allows for light, even the coloured properties of light, to bounce between points in the world. This again has a huge impact, depending on where you look. Going back to the rocks of the White Orchard, all conditions are exactly matched in this shot, time of day, weather, and yet we see RTGI adding a red hue to the sand as the colour of the rock spills down. And likewise, any areas with licking flames indoors, candlelight, you'll see that light property, the colour, bounce across nearby surfaces. All combined with the RTAO, it beds every object more naturally into the space. The final point for the RT mode is the reflections. Now, as I've covered in the preview, these aren't ray traced reflections, but instead you get a much improved screen space technique, SSR, so long as RT mode is engaged. So again, compared to the performance mode, PS5 enjoys much crisper, detailed reflections across the docks. Not only that, on RT mode, this SSR applies to more materials in the game, including armor and puddles across Novigrad's stone floor. Previously, The Witcher 3 used simpler cube mapping to create a base reflection for puddles, but now we get a proper mirror image. It's not ray tracing then, it is a shame, but the SSR upgrade is clear compared to the performance mode, which uses the older technique. Now, in visiting CDPR's offices a few weeks ago, I did actually ask one of the game's lead developers a few questions about this ray tracing mode, specifically Philip Weber, who's acting as the project's narrative director. In particular, I wanted to know why consoles don't get ray trace reflections or shadows as well, since they're included on PC. Why just SSR, albeit an improved SSR? Needless to say, it turns out having all four RT technologies enabled is quite a big ask and a huge toll on any GPU, and so ray traced reflections were seemingly put aside in favour of RTGI and RTAO on PS5 and Series X, just because the latter had a bigger impact. They gave more bang for their buck, in other words, given The Witcher 3 isn't as abundant in reflective surfaces as, say, Cyberpunk. In the end, RTGI and RTAO were deemed the better use of the power on tap on PS5 and Series X, and so, for the most complete ray tracing experience, that remains the preserve of top-end PC hardware for now. There's more to the upgrades than ray tracing, of course. Case in point, let's swap in the last gen version running on PS4 Pro, for example, versus PS5 as played with all the frills in its RT mode. The first point really has to be the enhanced foliage. A canter through Velen on horseback shows more flourishing plant life, much more densely laid out in the fields ahead. Better yet, the draw distance on PS5 is vastly superior now, meaning we get less of an obvious fade to grass in the near distance, a problem with the older PS4 Pro code. Also a nice touch I've noticed is that there are lit hay bales in the far distance which add plumes of smoke, all rendered at range on PS5. It's a much richer landscape to look at on PS5, and in fact you don't even need to use the RT mode to enjoy these extras either. It's all the exact same for the performance mode. Now, there's a multitude of other enhancements over PS4 Pro, the improved shadows, and of course, the boosted texture resolution also stand out. So, whether it's the RT mode, performance mode, on PS5 or Series X, materials for clothes, trees, brickwork, all of it presents using a much higher resolution asset. The complete edition delivers on the visual front then. When it comes to the frame rate performance though, it's less of a clear victory. In theory, running the older Xbox One or PS4 versions as is, no extras like ray tracing, foliage, textures and so on a Series X or PS5 will have made optimizing for 30 or 60 FPS much easier. But here, CDPR obviously has pushed the boat out. And unfortunately for now, that does mean the performance isn't as watertight in either mode as they might have been. Before we get to that though, the resolutions are worth touching on. Pitting PS5 against Series X in their ray tracing modes first, each targets a native 1440p, reconstructed using FSR 2.1, with dynamic resolution scaling taking the pixel count down to 1080p at worst. A bulk of pixel counts do hit that top 1440p number though. Meanwhile, we have the performance mode, which is bumped up to a higher target on each, aiming for 4K with 1080p used as the lower bounds. The net result is both PS5 and Series X do look sharper on their performance modes compared to running on the ray tracing modes. And I will say that Series X often runs at a higher resolution on average than PS5. For example, this route through Novigrad on the performance mode puts us at 1440p on PS5 and closer to 1800p on Series X for a spell. Keeping to the side-by-sides, the second point here is also curious. Comparing PS5 and Series X together, there appears to be a big difference in draw distance, especially for foliage. In other words, plants draw in much farther afield on PS5 than on Series X, leaving patches of the Xbox version's world looking more barren up ahead. At least up until we get close. To be clear, the actual density of foliage is identical once they actually do draw in, it's just the rendering range is set to a higher value on PS5, and consistently so too. Look at this horseback route through Velen for example. Whether you play on the ray tracing mode or performance mode, the result is the same. Xbox Series X lags behind in filling the backdrop here with plant life, and in other areas in fact, it's even apparent with shadow draw too, where Series X fades in shadow maps much later than PS5. A potential resolution advantage on Series X then, but then also a settings advantage for foliage and shadow draw on PS5. And both of these points have a bearing on the frame rate side of course. Now, if we start with the 60fps performance mode, up front I will say most areas are locked 60fps. It's really excellent. The White Orchard, even Crookback Bog, run surprisingly well at 60 on both PS5 and Series X, barring the odd one-frame hitch or auto-saving stutter. However, there are stress points, and some, like Novigrad City, are pretty integral to your enjoyment of the game. For Novigrad, PS5 is consistently ahead of Series X around the Hierarch Square, with a gap of 6 to 7 FPS in PS5's favourite times. Also, you'll notice Series X has light screen tearing right at the top of the display. It's not clear why there's bigger drops on Series X here, and as an aside, it's worth saying different runs through the city produce differing results too. So for example, on my first PS5 run past these docks, I had dips into the 50s, and then on the second run it's much clearer and tighter at 60fps. Series X falls short in the big city then, at least on patch 4.01. That said, PS5 isn't always ahead. If we leave Novigrad, we actually see the reverse situation. Battling with the bandits just before the Blood and Wine expansion kicks off, PS5 wavers below 60fps, while Series X clears it at a perfect 60fps lock. And likewise, the early Nightmare cutscene with the airborne ship has PS5 dropping into the 50s, whereas Xbox stays firm at the top line. These are all the extreme cases. And again, most portions of the game are neatly optimized for 60fps. From a PlayStation owner's perspective, it's a huge win overall. After all, the PS4 Pro version to this day is still capped at 30fps, running with a checkerboard rendered 4K. What PS5 offers now, in performance mode, is a big step forward at 60fps, even if there are these drops. As for Series X, it's less of a clear-cut advantage given, well, it already had a 60fps mode via the One X version, which had a performance option. Okay, next up, what of the 30fps ray tracing mode? Adding new features to PS5 and Series X like RTAO and RTGI does make this far more taxing on both machines, and to be blunt, in my experience playing PS5 to start, this mode's just not a 30fps lock. Even basic riding on horseback, battles, cutscenes, all of these points slip into the high 20s and a sustained 25fps at points. It especially sticks out switching from, well, the mostly smooth performance mode at 60, and for perspective, even PS4 Pro runs many of these areas at a more consistent 30 FPS, which in essence makes PS5's ray tracing mode a step back. The brutal reality is, for all the benefits ray tracing mode brings, it feels unpleasant to actually play this way. Novigrad City is especially rough on PS5 in this case, and any panning motion, especially without motion blur enabled, makes for pretty tough viewing. We'll get to the Xbox Series X ray tracing mode in a moment. First though, there's another issue with the ray tracing mode to address: the latency. Be it PS5 or Series X, there's just a significantly higher input lag with the 30 FPS cap in place. Taking PS5 as an example, though this applies on Series X, I decided to put some numbers to this. Using a 120 FPS camera and measuring from the first nudge of the right analog stick, it takes the performance mode 92 milliseconds to respond with the first frame of camera movement. As for the ray tracing mode, well, that response time jumps up to around 157 milliseconds. Of course, neither feels especially snappy, and part of the increased delay for the ray tracing mode is inherent in capping to 30 FPS. But still, it's noticeably less responsive once all the ray tracing features are engaged. So, if you're wondering why it feels different on the ray tracing mode, that's the answer. There's around 65 milliseconds of added latency once you switch mode. As a result, and with the frame rate drops too, the game sadly doesn't feel good to play on the ray tracing mode right now. Moving over to the Xbox Series X version, this console fares much better in overall frame rate on the ray tracing mode. In fact, a surprising bulk of play locks to that 30 FPS target with no real issue. So for comparison, here's how Series X runs in all the stress points we found on PS5, where the turnout in general shows a far better optimized game. Traveling by horseback shows a locked 30 FPS, as does this battle with the bandits. So Series X in the ray tracing mode runs better than PS5 for almost every case. Now, the one area Series X does buckle in is, you guessed it, this route through Novigrad Center. Here we go down to as low as 23 FPS, but then this practically matches PS5's equally low level of performance through the same run. Again, the likeliest culprit is a CPU side bottleneck on both sides, though Series X is again typically a frame or two to the better here. In summary then, the ray tracing mode struggles to run well in the big city for both PS5 and Series X. Outside of the city though, Series X does seem to have a much more level 30 FPS. The verdict on which version is best is hardly clear-cut then. You get better foliage and shadow draw on PS5, but then worse performance on its ray tracing mode. And neither console using the ray tracing mode feels especially great, certainly factoring in the added input latency. Of course, the 60 FPS performance mode improves the stuttering frame rates and higher latency, and in my case, I actually ended up using the performance mode exclusively just because it lessens those distractions, but it's obviously a shame to lose the ray tracing features. There's no perfect solution. Adding to the complication is the game's overall stability right now. So on both PS5 and Series X, I've had several software crashes, freezes, just wandering the world. Crashes are possible even loading a save game, which then takes you back to either console's front end, Xbox in this case, and on PS5 it forced me to close the app and restart it. This is hardly ideal, and it's surely on CDPR's radar for the next patch, and I'm really hoping it lands sooner rather than later. Again, it's just a sign this update needed much more time in the oven. The final point to touch on is at least a positive one: the loading times. Honestly, this is just a huge plus point. Track back to the PS4 Pro version, and just loading a save file or fast traveling, you'll be faced with this lengthy loading screen. In this case, loading our save at Velen Village takes PS4 Pro 1 minute 35 seconds, but if we switch to the new generation machines, well, PS5 and Series X chop that number right down to just over 13 seconds on PS5 and 16 seconds on Series X. Another advantage for PS5 then, but really there isn't much in this. The Witcher 3's faster loading times ranks as a huge step forward for the game's playability regardless of which console you choose. Overall, The Witcher 3 Complete Edition is an ambitious next-gen release, with the huge plus being that it's a free update, but equally, it being free doesn't spare it from some criticism. The main issues with it for now relate to stability, the crashes on PS5 and Series X, and also performance struggling to hit a locked 30 FPS in the RT mode, notably on PS5. And even at 30 FPS, it doesn't exactly feel great owing to the high input latency. The loading time boosts are fantastic, as are the ray tracing extras, updated foliage, shadows, and textures, but the basics of hitting a consistent, smooth frame rate are a must, especially after playing PS4 Pro or One X versions, which ran fine on these newer machines. Otherwise, it's hard to imagine much more being added to The Witcher 3 via a free update. After all, it's a 7-year-old game, using the same engine as before. It's just these lingering few issues that came with the patch update desperately need fixing. For The Witcher 3, this really is it. As far as CDPR is planning, the intent now is to only produce smaller patch updates, bug fixes, going forward for the game. Also, as a Red Engine title, this is the last time we'll see CDPR's in-house tech being used in the Witcher series as the series moves to Unreal Engine 5. And potentially with some more work, it's a great note to leave it on. Even at 7 years old, The Witcher 3 has never looked better, the visual upgrades really do shine, and if the performance issues are addressed here too, this really will be the definitive way to play the game. The Series S analysis is to follow, as I've mentioned, but if you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.